Well, hello again, English 1020 fans. Today in my part 1, week 8 video, I want to talk to you about setting in poetry, what happens, where, and when. And to follow along with me, please go to content up toward the top of our Brightspace page, and then click on course documents and look for the setting in poetry, what happens, where, and when document. So, as with fiction, when you're analyzing a poem or explicating it, remember that word, which means essentially explaining it, ask yourself those 5 W questions, just as we did in fiction. So, who is speaking and to whom? What is actually happening? So, what's literally happening in the poem? Try to figure that out first. Why is this event or experience happening, and why is it important? Why does it matter? When is it happening? So when in history is it happening? What time of the day is it happening? What time of the year is it happening? Remember that the seasons of the year and the times of day in literature correspond with the human life cycle. And as we've said before, that tells you something. And then finally, where is it happening? So where in the world? Where in the country? Is it an urban setting? Is it a rural setting? And remember, spatial setting, again, you use these terms when writing about poetry, refers to the place involved, the literal physical space. So what part of the world, what part of the country is the poem set in? What does this place look like? Is it beautiful? Is it not so hot? Is it ugly? Is it urban? Is it rural? And then temporal refers to time, the temporal setting. So what time in history, what specific date or era, what time of the year, what time of day. And use those terms, spatial and temporal setting, in the writing of your papers, because that makes you sound so much more elevated and so much more like an academic writer. So for example, if I'm looking at a poem whose temporal setting is occurring at sunrise, for example, I might look for the idea of the connotative meanings of sunrise and how that corresponds with a human life cycle. So sunrise would indicate maybe a birth, maybe a beginning, right? If I'm talking about temporal setting and I'm talking about the time of the year, and I'm looking at a poem set in winter, then that time of the year would correspond with aging and death in a human life cycle. So I'm going to think about the connotative meanings there. And remember, just like with fiction, not all poems have an identifiable setting. Now, most fictional pieces will have that. Not all of them, but most of them. But with poems, it's even more so that way. Sometimes you can't pinpoint, okay, here's where the poem is happening. Here's exactly when it is happening. Some poems simply present thoughts and feelings, and they're called lyrical or lyric poems. And others depend crucially on a sense of place or time to establish meaning. So ask yourself how heavily the poem that you're analyzing depends on setting to establish its ideas, its characters, and its themes. That gives you something to write about. Even if your poem is a lyric poem and it's focused on emotions and ideas, and it doesn't have a specific setting. That technique allows the writer an advantage in a way, because it allows you, the reader, to sort of input the setting in your mind that might best resonate with you. So even an absence of knowledge here gives you something to write about in paper 2. And note that some poems will vividly describe their settings while other will offer only the most general details, again allowing you, the reader, to fill in the blanks. So ask yourself why that might be the case and what advantages that gives the poet in this particular work and why. And also, don't confuse the time that the poem was written and published with the setting, because someone may write a poem in 2017 that's about something that happened 200 years ago, and the setting is 200 years ago. So don't say, oh, well, the setting is 2017, because that's when it was written or published, right? So you want to keep that in mind. And then as you read, always think about why the poet may have made his or her choices regarding setting. And now the next thing that I want to talk to you about is internal structure in poetry. And to locate that document and follow along with me, which is always a good idea, go again to content, go to course documents, and then look for internal structure in poetry. So any skilled writer, whether he or she is composing a short story, a book, a song lyric, a poem, a play, whatever it might be, will understand the importance of choosing and arranging words in order to create the best interpretation of their meaning for the reader, and to create visual effects and aural effects, so what we hear when we read that poem aloud. And in poetry especially, individual words exist not just within phrases or patterns of rhythm, but also within the larger organic wholeness of the work, because a poem really should create sort of a sense of organic wholeness about it. So a good writer is going to ask, how can I organize this work? What needs to come first? What comes last? What's the overall effect of the arrangement that I'm creating here? Now that doesn't mean that when you're in that zone of creativity that you try to think and outline and pinpoint when you're writing your poem. And no, you want to be in that creative zone and let what is coming, what's being channeled into you, come to you. But then use your craft and think about, what if I now rearranged it? What if I did X, Y, or Z? That's where the craft part of it comes into play. So the arrangement of wording, along with elements like the tone, how the poem is making you feel as you read it. Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling happy? The speaker, so who's talking to you in the poem? The situation and setting, the theme, that all-important underlying meaning, the diction, the imagery and sound, all of that together is called internal structure or internal form. So you want to keep in mind the various types or genres of poems. You have narrative poems, so they tell a story, obviously. You have dramatic poems, and those are poems concentrating on dialogue or presenting a scene or a series of scenes. And then you have a poem of contrast, so a poem that will present maybe opposing or contrasting views or subject matter. And so the poem may be going along and then all of a sudden, boom, it does something totally different that you didn't expect, that contrasts with what it did before. You have lyric poems, poems that are descriptive and characterized, as we just said, by emotions, ideas, by the poet's state of mind. And then you have a poem that centers on a shift in tone or subject matter. So the first part of the poem may seem happy and really fun, and then all of a sudden it may shift completely into a very dark sort of feeling and subject matter. So those are the different genres of poems in terms of their internal structure. And poems can be divided into internal parts that are distinguished from each other by a shift, as we just said, either in subject matter, in tone, maybe in address. So you might have in one stanza one person who is the speaker, and then in the next stanza someone else is speaking. They also might be able to be divided up and talked about according to the tense being used. So maybe the poem begins in past tense and shifts to present, or maybe the mode. So a shift from maybe storytelling, from a narrative sort of poem, to reflection or description, more like a lyric poem. Shifts often, almost always occur between stanzas, but they can occur within a line or, within one sentence. So interestingly, some poems do not contain any shifts at all. Many of them don't. And so it's harder to find distinctive parts when you're looking at internal structure, but nevertheless, the works are still organized in order to figure out how the poem is moving. So for example, in Whitman's very famous poem, I Hear America Singing, if you're familiar with that one, there's no real distinct shift within the work at all. There's no contrast, but the way it's structured internally mimics and reveals its main theme, and that can often be the case because the poem is structured like one long sentence in one single stanza that refers to a multitude of all these different people and songs that they sing as Americans. So because of that, its internal structure mirrors and divulges its theme, the idea that all Americans work together to create a sense of harmony, which is, of course, an American value reflected through the motto on our seal, E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of the many, one. So that's sort of the whole theme, the whole idea of Whitman's I Hear America Singing, and the internal structure of the poem really mimics that theme and presents that theme if you look at it thoughtfully. So as you're explicating your poem for paper 2, you want to ask yourself the following questions about its internal structure. So first of all, did it seem to divide naturally into internal parts? So do you see any of those shifts that maybe we mentioned earlier? If so, where and why? This gives you something to write about. What are those major shifts in the poem? Did it shift in tone, maybe from joyful to sad or vice versa? Did it shift in tense from past to present or vice versa? Did it shift in subject matter, topic? How does each part build on those that have come before? And if it didn't shift, then maybe ask yourself why. And remember, poems are meant to be read aloud. And remember that the thought doesn't necessarily stop where the line stops. And the sentence doesn't necessarily stop where the line stops in a poem. Even if there's a comma there, the thought or the sentence may continue on into the next line and the next. Or like with Whitman's poem, the poem itself may be one long sentence, one long thought. So don't be fooled by the line breaks. Understand that the thought or the sentence may not end there. So think about how all the parts combine into a meaningful whole, and if it doesn't seem to divide into internal parts, then can you find some organizing sense of principle? And that internal structure gives you yet another element to write about in paper 2. And now finally, let's look at that document, Quoting from Poetry. And this is very important because the protocol for quoting from poetry in your papers is a little bit different from otherwise using quotes. So if you want to pull up that document, again, it's found under Content, Course Documents, and then Quoting from Poetry. So I give you some examples here, or actually this is a sheet from the department, the English department, giving you examples that illustrate the correct way to incorporate quotations from poetry into your paper. So notice the rules that they illustrate and follow them in your own writing of paper 2, because this is important. So first off, and this is true with any time you're quoting, be selective. Choose only the most effective phrases to quote. Don't just quote to be quoting, right? You want to find a phrase that is really effective and that's going to back up the claim that you're making about theme or whatever it might be. And then this also applies every time you're quoting, to poetry and otherwise. Integrate your quotes smoothly and grammatically into your own phrasing. Remember, the quote cannot exist as a sentence all by itself in your paper. If there's a period before it and a period at the end of your citation, and that quote's all by itself as a sentence, it's dropped, and you're going to have points deducted. And usually they're pretty major points. So you want to make sure that you have some writing of your own, some phrasing of your own that introduces that quote and that is part of the same sentence into which that quote is fitting. And you want to use, and this is something different that we don't do with prose, a diagonal mark like that I've given you there within the parentheses to indicate line divisions when you're quoting up to 3 lines of poetry. And you want to leave a space, one space on either side of that diagonal. So you've got, within your quote, let's say you're quoting lines 1 through 3. You've got line 1, space, diagonal space, line 2, space, diagonal space, line 3, space, diagonal space. That is how it works. And if you're quoting more than 3 lines, create a block quote and reproduce the way the lines appear in the original poem. So don't run them together with diagonals if you're doing a block quote. Just make them appear the way they actually appear on the page in the original poem. So if you remember about a block quote has certain conventions that are different from an ordinary quote, and we're going to think about that here in just a moment more specifically. Keep those long, especially those block quotes, to a minimum in your paper, because like any device, they're going to lose their effectiveness if you overuse them too much. So it's better to tuck little short phrases and clauses into your writing and reserve those long quotes for exceptionally powerful passages. Oftentimes 1010 students think they have to quote the entire passage or something. No, you can just tuck 2 or 3 little words from a quote into your phrasing, and often that is better. And then in poetry, you always cite line numbers in the body of your paper when you're quoting. In your parentheses in MLA, rather than putting the author's last name and the page number, you put the author's last name and the line number or numbers, not the page numbers in those parenthetical citations. So here are some actual examples. In spite of all the things which the speaker admits love cannot do, she explains that, quote, many a man is making friends with death, unquote, precisely because he does not have love in his life. So all of the wording except many a man is making friends with death would be the author's wording, not the poet's wording, not from the quote, right? And see how the writer there has just tucked those words, many a man is making friends with death, into his or her own sentence structure. So that's what you want to do. And then in parentheses, you have the line number 7. Now, the department did not include the writer's name there. And if this was the first time that you were quoting from this author, or if you had been switching back and forth with the different sources, and you're in a situation where you're now quoting from this author, you would have the author's last name in that parenthetical citation, and then the line number with no comma in between. And see how the period comes after the citation, after the last parenthesis mark? It does not come after the word life. That is not where your sentence ends. It ends after your in-text citation. Here's the second example. Shakespeare presents a humorous but touching example of true love with his speaker's devotion to his mistress in spite of her imperfections, such as her reeking breath and the, quote, black wires that grow on her head, unquote. That's kind of a fun poem if you ever read it. And then in parentheses, we have the line numbers 8, 4, into parentheses, and again, then the period. The period doesn't come after the word head. There's no punctuation there in MLA. So notice that the only words actually quoted from the poem are black wires grow on her head. And the word that has brackets around it. So if you don't know, if you didn't learn this in 1010, and you should have, hopefully, anytime you're going to change maybe just 1 or 2 words in a quote, and all the other wording in the quote will be the same, obviously, then you use brackets to indicate the word or the couple of words that you've changed. If you have to change more than a couple of words, you just need to paraphrase the quote. Put it in your own words. And then again, cite at the end with the author's last name and the line number in this case. So here, this writer changed whatever the original wording was into that. And the reason is so that the phrase, black wires that grow on her head, would fit naturally and grammatically into the sentence structure that this writer has created here. So why is 8, 4 listed there? Well, because the first little section, black wires, is from line 8, and grow on her head is from line 4. So we put a comma to separate those 2 lines that aren't in order there. By referring to the, quote, road, or to, quote, the road all runners come, unquote, and then we have the line number here, comma, Hausman broadens his theme to include all human beings as they make their way through life. So here's an example of how you can put the in-text citation sort of in the middle of your sentence. It's usually easier to do it at the end, but this works as well. And note that you don't have to mention Hausman here in number 3 or Shakespeare's name in number 2, because you've mentioned their names in your sentence where you have your quote. Now, if you had not mentioned Hausman's name here within that in-text citation, first you'd have to have Hausman 5, right? And number 4, because the athlete dies before anyone has broken his record, The world will never consider him one of those, quote, runners whom renown outran, unquote. And then you have the line number 19. And again, you know, if you had been quoting Hausman and you were in the same paragraph and you had not quoted anyone else, within that paragraph you wouldn't have to repeat Hausman there. But if you were jumping back and forth or beginning a new paragraph, you would need to list Hausman's name. The Duke's pride, not his heart, is offended by his last Duchess's tendency to treat everyone with friendliness and courtesy, comma, quote, as if she ranked, space, diagonal, space, his, bracketed, gift of a 900 years old name, space, diagonal, space, with anybody's gift, unquote. So see how the diagonals are used there, because you've got 1, 2, 3 lines of poetry. So anytime you're quoting 3 lines or more, you need to use those brackets. And also notice that the word his is placed, or I should have said diagonals there. You need to use the diagonals. Getting my diagonals and my brackets confused. And the brackets are around the word his. Well, that's probably because the original poem didn't use that pronoun, or perhaps the writer added it to sort of make the quote a little bit more clear to the reader here. But that's where this writer of this paper, using this quote, bracketed the word his, because he or she added that in there, and it's not part of the original quote. So here you have a situation where you have line 32, 33, and 34, and what you can do is put 32-34, or you could put 32, 33, 34. And then number 6, wanting all her attention focused on himself, the Duke resents his wife for having a heart, quote, too soon made glad, unquote, by the simple pleasures of life. And then line 22. Now again, you really need to put the author's last name in front of those line numbers in your in-text citation. You know, unless you are within a paragraph and you've already done that in your first quote in that paragraph, and you're not switching to any other source within that paragraph. Number 7, the speaker thinks for himself and realizes this particular wall is unnecessary to keep peace between the neighbors, colon. Quote, he is all pine and I am apple orchard, space, diagonal, space. My apple trees will never get across, space, diagonal, space, and eat the cones under his pines, ... end quote. And then in parentheses 24 through 26, and then your period at the end. So you've got the use of diagonals because you're quoting up to 3 lines in poetry. If you quote 4 or more lines, you really ought to block the quote, and we're going to see that in the next example. And you've got lines 24, 25, and 26, so there's the use of the dash. And again, the writer here would have been Robert Frost, so you really should have Frost 24-26 in your in-text citation. And then number 8 is an example of a drop or a block quote. With wry humor, the speaker realizes there is nothing he can do to force his neighbor to be a more enlightened, independent thinker, colon. And then you've got the ellipses again, and the department made a boo-boo here. There should only be 3, ... not 4. So an ellipsis indicates that there's something more. So in number 7, for example, with the line, and eat the cones under his pines, the ... ellipsis, which is what that's called, indicates there's more to that line, but we left it out. And so here before the I see him there, the ellipsis indicates there's more to that line that came before this, but I left that out, right? So I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand like an old stone savage armed, etc., etc. And then notice there is a period after the word saying at the very end there before the in-text citation, and there's no period after it. And notice there are no quotation marks and there are no diagonals. So when we use a block quote format, all of the rules in MLA just go crazy. And MLA says, guess what? You don't need to use quotation marks anymore because your reader knows this is a quote because you've blocked it. you've indented all the lines 10 spaces from the left margin. So you're good. You don't have to use quotation marks. And MLA says, with a block quote, you do need to put the period after the very last word in your quote, not after the in-text citation. So MLA turns right around and breaks all the rules that it's just drilled into your brain earlier. Why? Sometimes I think maybe it's just because they want to just make us all want to go jump off a bridge. I don't know. That doesn't really make any sense to me there, but that's MLA for you. Sometimes it just doesn't make good sense. So those are just some of the conventions of quoting from poetry, and note that your little Siegel handbook contains sections about that in the MLA chapter that you can access and look at in the chapter before that, I believe. And it's always a good idea to sort of brush up your skills there. So thank you for paying attention this fine day, whichever day this is that you're paying attention to the week 8 video. And look what I did. Rather than dividing them into part 1 and part 2, I just crammed them all in here into one great big video. So joy to the world. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you next time around.